Welcome back to Out of the Fog. Well, with more and more acts of violence against transgendered persons and youth making its way into the news, it's given our next guest more reason to attempt to motion the inclusion of protection of gender expression and gender identity in the Newfoundland and Labrador Human Rights Act. Now, this is to create equal and safe environment for transgender people in this province. Joining me now is the NDP MHA for St. John's Centre, Gerry Rogers. Thanks so much for joining me here in studio.
Thank you very much, Gerry.
Yeah, so I think first off, you just briefly tell me what exactly does transgender mean?
Well, it means somebody who may have been born with a certain sexual identity, whether it be male, and that they will then transition to a sex that is not their original biological birth.
What is, I just want to know, what connection do you have personally to implementing gender expression and identity into the Newfoundland and Labrador Human Rights Act?
Well, I think, I've worked as a human rights activist most of my life, certainly all my adult life, and I know how important our human rights legislation is. And I worked really hard on having, on women's rights. I worked really hard on having sexual orientation rights included in our Human Rights Act. At the time it was a Human Rights Code, and now it's almost the last frontier is the whole issue of trans rights and the rights, and there's been resistance, but we know that transgendered folks are among the most bullied, the most misunderstood, the most vilified, and also the ones where the most hate crimes with incidents of violence are committed against them. Those are a group of people, and there are brothers, our sisters, our aunts, our uncles, there are neighbors, our doctors, our lawyers, our chefs, our politicians even. And those are the people whose rights are not explicitly covered in our Human Rights Act. They are in a number of places across the country and around the world, but Newfoundland seems to be holding out.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think the difference between Newfoundland and, like you mentioned, other parts in Canada or the world?
Well, I'm not sure. It takes a certain level of understanding, and it takes a political will. Our current Minister of Justice and the Minister of Justice before him both say, well, it's understood within our Human Rights Act. But our Human Rights Act, in fact, and all human rights legislation should be living documents. They need to change according to our understanding of who we are as a community and what's important to us as a community. And they might say, for instance, well, transgender rights are included under sex and under sexual orientation, but they're not. And what we see, for instance, in Nova Scotia, Ontario, Manitoba, the Northwest Territories, they've all changed their human rights legislation to explicitly identify gender identity and gender expression. And this is done now on the federal level as well in Canada. The UN Declaration of Human Rights has now included it. South Africa has. There's a number of countries. There's a whole movement now to look at how important it is to include this in our human rights legislation. Why is Newfoundland holding out? I can't for the life of me figure it out. And it's simply time to do the right thing. So when they say, well, it's read in as sex, it's not. And for instance, if you look at an employment issue, if a person is fired because they're male, they can go to the Human Rights Commission and they can lodge a complaint. If a person is hired because they're transgender, or fired, they're not hired because they're male. They're fired because they were a female who has become a man, or if they're denied housing. And so in order to access and to file a human rights complaint, if you are a transgendered person, you then first have to get over the first legal hurdle to prove, no, it's not because of sex, it's not because of sexual orientation, it's because I'm a transgender person.
So that's why you feel there needs to be a differentiate between the sexual identity and then the gender identity for those reasons.
Well, the fact that you're a transgendered individual, absolutely. And without it, The other thing that our Human Rights Act does is that it compels and holds our government not only does the Human Rights Commission hear complaints and then we try to resolve those complaints, but it also then is compelled to do education. So unless it's explicitly identified in our Human Rights Act, they're not compelled to do public education. And the role of the Human Rights Commission in doing public education is to try to prevent discrimination, to try to lessen the impacts of discrimination. And as a modern society, we want that. You know, we want to be able to educate our community and say, you know what, this is something we have to look at as a community.
Do you think that part is missing? You talk about the education and teaching, you know, our youth and dispelling the discrimination, and you brought up earlier about just the overall just understanding. Is that a big part of all of this, just for people to understand, you know, what is transgender? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. But, you know, I think, Aaron, the interesting thing is that our youth are far ahead of us. And, you know, politicians often and laws often lag way behind where the community is. The only reason we have sexual orientation in our Human Rights Act is because the community pushed. And the community's pushing for this. You know, there's a number of schools across the province who have gay-straight alliances. They know that they're signing a petition asking the government to change the Human Rights Act. They're pushing. They're doing education in their own schools. And that's really important. So it's time. It's just simply time for the government to do this. It's time to do the right thing. There's no reason not to. It doesn't cost any money. You know, it's about making our human rights legislation responsive to what we know and hold important as a community. And our own Human Rights Commission has also said to the government, it's time to change our Human Rights Act. And they've done that a few years ago, and they keep saying that. So why this government doesn't respond to it is beyond me.
All right, well, Gerry, we're going to have to leave it there for tonight. I want to thank you very much for coming in and joining us in on the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to be right back, but if you have a comment you'd like to make about this interview with Gerry Rogers or anything else you see on the show, here's how to get in touch with Out of the Fog. We like hearing from you, so let us know what you think of tonight's show. Leave your name and number, and we may just broadcast those comments. Call us at 757-9600 or drop us an email, outofthefog@rci.rogers.com.